Okay, Josh, welcome to the Walled Garden podcast. And I guess before I let you maybe introduce yourself to everybody at home, I just want to let everybody know that if they want to hear one of my all-time favorite interviews that I've ever given, please head over to Joshua's podcast, In Search of Wisdom. Beautiful work that you're doing over there, and just a really wonderful interviewer. And so I was honored to be on your show and to have that conversation with you. And this is a continuation, and I guess my chance to pick your brain, because you have a really beautiful interview style, Joshua, where you're a very generous interviewer. You ask the question, you allow the answer to happen, you ask another question. I find myself, I often just like dominate the conversation, which is what I'm doing now. But I really liked your style. So thank you for having me on your show. And I'm really excited to have you here today. So why don't you just, for the people at home, introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll dive in.
Well, I have to say it's a pleasure to be here. And those are some kind words. Definitely. I really appreciate it. I've been I would say a long time listener to your show in the way of the last year or two. So I've listened to you do a number of interviews, and I feel like I've got a lot of wisdom from you and the many guests that you've had on. So I'm super grateful to be on that list now.
I'm honored. Thank you.
A little bit about me is I'm curious about wisdom. I started a podcast probably, I guess, coming up on a year now, maybe 7-8 months, something like that, called In Search of Wisdom, just to scratch the kind of insatiable curiosity that I have over the last, I would say, about 10 years or so. I've really read a lot and, like yourself, explored many different paths from Stoicism to Buddhism to Christianity to philosophy. So I'm far from an expert on really anything, but other than maybe a bit of curiosity. And I spent my adult life in the military, the U.S. military, and after I retired, worked for a couple of years in doing consulting stuff in DC, and recently kind of moved to a small town and started this, small company that I call the Perennial Leader Project, which is just an opportunity to hopefully maybe search and spread wisdom that is hopefully a bit useful for people out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to talk to you about the kind of interaction between wisdom and leadership today. But I guess first I'm gonna pick on you about your bookshelf there, and you've obviously been searching a lot, for a lot of your life for deeper wisdom. As you say, it's become both a passion project in terms of putting out the podcast and really seeking wisdom in interview style, but also you've been reading a lot. I wonder if there are any books, any philosophers, writers, poets, whatever it is, who surprised you when you read their work in terms of the amount of wisdom you were able to gain from it. Obviously we all have these kind of favorite philosophers that kind of get pushed to the top. Was there anything that surprised you that you thought, this is something that I really didn't expect to find here, but I did?
That's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind is meditations. I mean, I think part of it is because if you take that seriously, that this was his personal diary or journal, and he's writing to himself about the interconnectedness of things. Or I think last time we chatted on In Search of Wisdom, talking about that opening passage of book 2. It's just remarkable to me that someone is thinking like that. I tend to think these days around wisdom and love, and that comes through for me in Marcus Aurelius in many of these passages. I have a favorite quote of his, the fruit of this life is a good character and acts for the common good. You constantly
Mm,
see that and in much of his writing. To me, it's very similar to some of the Christian mystics, some of these people that are just seeing the world and seeing people different than the majority of us do. And there's, I think, a lot to learn there.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And of course, everybody will be familiar with the meditations who listens to this. And you mentioned you're interested in kind of wisdom and love. I heard this beautiful kind of summary of what you might say the Christian faith is trying to get at recently. Somebody, I think it was Jordan Peterson, actually, he said it's something like spoken truth in the service of love. There seemed, and you mentioned that a lot of Marcus's writings seem to kind of echo the same sentiment that you find in some of the Christian mystics. Uh, what are you talking about when you kind of mention this wisdom and love? This interaction. What do you see in it?
Well, I tend to try to think about the how. It's like how, if we say a good character, I think we know what that is. We can think about virtues and principles. We kind of have an image and can look to, sages throughout history. And also on the other side of that, these acts for the common good, we kind of know what that is. But the how is extremely difficult. I wouldn't say I have the answer to it, but even to the quote from Jordan Peterson, it sparks my curiosity of, yeah, how do you do that? How do you, like, rubber meets the road from a very practical standpoint, integrate that into daily life, which is sometimes what's challenging around, when you read mystics or philosophy, it's difficult to get that transition to into daily life. Okay, how do we put that into practice? And I tend to think, I believe, similar to you, and which comes through in the poet and the sage, of it's a bit of how we receive information, whether it's our perspective, through all of the senses, and how we make sense of it. And if you
Mm,
look at I like the opening passage in book 2 as an example of, we're going to meet difficult people in life, reality. But then that passage continues beautifully of how do we make sense of that? How do we navigate that? And, there's some real specific wisdom in there of what is working together and what is necessarily working against.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And you mentioned, we kind of know it might be intuitively, what we might do to improve our character. I mean, one of the most important things that I ever learned from Peterson, I always call him Peterson. Who cares? All right. Um, but one of the most important things I learned was, like, yes, sit by the side of your bed and pray. And what he means by pray is, like, ask, what are some of the things that I'm doing in my life right now that if I keep on doing them 10 years from now, they're going to absolutely ruin me. And it's like, you immediately, like, I get like 10 answers at once. It's like stop this, and this. But then again, uh, you you do bring up a good point. Like, how do we really know? Because I'm constantly wrestling with this, because I think whenever you take on any sort of uh, ambitious philosophical project, I think that there should always be a part of you. And I was speaking to about this with my guest yesterday, a good friend of mine, and I kind of said, I've always got this thing in the back of my mind that is saying, are you really doing this for the right reasons? You might proclaim that you're doing it out of love for humanity, but man, there might be a really prideful, deceitful part of you that is making you say that, and you actually believe it because you're saying it, and you actually believe it because you're writing it. And then, you might not know until later on that your motivations were completely screwed up, but you were just saying to everybody, this is my aim, this is what I'm coming here to, really help. But really you were just in it for the, to become a sophist, to make some money from your wisdom, or to do, so I wonder, how do you think we guard against those less than healthy motivations? Might be resentment, might be the desires that we have, those basic animal desires. How do we guard against those? And how do you think we get a better sense of our true motivations as we're engaging in something like this, such as, in search of wisdom, stuff like that?
That is a great question, Simon.
Yeah, let's figure it out today, shall we?
I absolutely love it, and feel almost a bit intimidated even trying to answer it. But I'll throw out some thoughts. The name, as I said in the beginning, is this Perennial Leader Project, and I very much like this word perennial. I like these perennial questions of life. And I think there is a big tendency, whatever path that we set out on, to think that we're climbing X mountain, and when we reach the top of that particular mountain, then we will have achieved something or have some greater understanding. And I think a lot of the, I guess, spiritual thinkers, if you will, and I think there's a lot of people saying the same things, whether it be philosophy or spiritual path, that it's not necessarily about going anywhere. It's also not necessarily about realizing or achieving something. It's about some sort of infinite path that we never truly arrive. We're constantly on the path, and that can be difficult to swallow. And if we reflect on whatever particular project, task, whatever we're doing, now obviously some things have an end, but some of these big type of things, I think that you're referring to, how we're thinking about it. Are we thinking about climbing a mountain? Or are we thinking about kind of like that proverb of, beyond mountains are more mountains? And it connects with me with this idea of, virtue for its own sake. Like, are we doing this for its own sake? Would this be, is this something that you would do for absolutely nothing? And I think that connects with me. If we think about this in search of wisdom thing, it is absolutely for its own sake. In one part, for very selfish reasons, for, to scratch my own curiosity, but also putting it out, and maybe there's people that get something from it as well.
Yeah. You're reminding me of something that Seneca said. He talked about seeking the goods of the soul, the goods that come, from the soul, within the soul, of the soul. It's like it is its own reward, and this idea as well of, you really spiked my interest when you're talking about this infinite path, right? Because I feel like in many ways, the kind of modern materialistic atheistic interpretation of the world, this foundational belief that so many people have, has, in many ways, we've lost that kind of infinite path, that perhaps, you see this in Seneca, you see this in Marcus Aurelius, you see this in a lot of the Christian writers and a lot of these ancient philosophers, that the style of writing, it's almost as if the style of writing matches their dedication to that infinite path. Something draws you into those ancient writings because they weren't just speaking to the spirit of their current age. Like I was speaking about this yesterday as well, is I feel like the spirit of our current age is that kind of personal development, motivation sort of stuff, which is fine. It's a gateway into those ancient texts, right? Because then you start to realize, oh, all this motivational stuff, it's kind of like potentially a dumbed down version of what these ancients were trying to get at. But I wonder if we have lost that infinite path in the current, what Jung would have called the spirit of our current age. And I wonder if that is the reason why we find ourselves now just, there's a mass exodus back to these ancient texts. We're all going back to these ancient works and saying, what is it that they had that we don't have today? Like, I wonder, do you find that in, kind of modern versus ancient writings at all? And if not, that's fine. But, perhaps I'm just an absolute noob, but well, that's definitely the case. Anyway, I'll let you answer.
Well, it's the case for me as well. But I wonder if it's the idea that you're bringing up of maybe something that we're in a different place now, than others. I wonder if that's also kind of an infinite path. Like 2,000 years ago, Seneca is writing that, there's basically the sage is very rare, once every 500 years, this, enlightened person, extremely rare. That's still the case today. I think most people would agree. Maybe 2,000 years from now, that will also still be the case, that the sage is rare. And it's like the idea of humility, wisdom, uncertainty are just these universal things of human nature.
Yeah, certainly. And that idea of the sage is a strange one to crack. But I want to continue with this, maybe perhaps talking about our current time, because you spent a lot of time, thinking about and working in the world of leadership and wisdom. I have to tell you something that I've been really kind of worried about lately. I guess what I'm hoping is that we will turn things around, but it seems like, so there's that statement that Jung taught. Well, it wasn't a statement, I'm not going to be able to quote it fully, but Jung basically said that, with our technological advancements that are about to hit us all, if our wisdom doesn't match those technological advancements, then, we're basically going to go in a spiral until we all just, kill ourselves. It's going to be madness. We now live in our current time where so many technological advancements are coming together at once. And I don't know if we have the wisdom to be able to deal with all this. And you look around the world at everything that's happening. I even think, and this is why I want to bring it into leadership, I think that one of the things that's happened in my own country here in Australia is that a lot of us are starting to realize that perhaps our leaders don't necessarily have the wisdom that they should, especially in a time such as this. I'll give you an example. We'll call out the Premier of Western Australia here. Western Australia's got some pretty tight restrictions at the moment. I won't get political with this, although it's probably inherent in the question. He was asked at a conference the other day, or a press conference. I think essentially the journalist asked him, listen, you've got all these people protesting saying, we really don't like the fact that you're trying to now force us to take this vaccine. We just want other people to have the choice, and we have the choice as well. But one of the things that keeps on happening with the leaders in Australia and also the media is presenting this as they're all a bunch of anti-vaxxers, which just isn't the case. And you see that they're saying this, it's not what we're about. But this journalist essentially asked him, don't you think it's a little bit dangerous that you keep on referring to all of these people here as anti-vaxxers, clearly making a statement about what you think they will believe when it's not true? And I wouldn't have minded if he gave a response that was calm and, saying, listen, I really do think that if you break it down, essentially but no, he really kind of flew off the handle. And one of the most arrogant responses I've ever heard it was basically black or white. Nope, if you're in the streets protesting against this, you are definitely anti-vax, no question about it. I don't care. And he went on like this for a couple of minutes, I believe. And that really worried me, because that's not wisdom at all. If somebody asks you a genuine question, you might want to show that you have the reason, you have the wisdom, you have the care and the nourishing ability to take that question, to think about it, and to give a calm, well-reasoned response, especially in a time when division is so high. I wonder, do you think that the leadership around the world, whether it is in politics or other areas, do you think that there's a struggle between leadership and wisdom? Do you think that we've lost a little bit of that wisdom in our leadership in our modern time?
I guess in terms of losing it, I would almost want to say I'm not sure that we ever had it, other than maybe just a few individuals.
Yeah.
I think it's probably something, extremely rare. So there may be, some leaders that come occasionally and have that wisdom. Some people may say, like an Abraham Lincoln, which there's always debate on whoever you bring up, but I would say it's always been rare, and maybe it will always be rare. I mean, if you think in terms of some political debate, could you imagine Socrates on the stage at a political debate, answering, I don't know? That's not necessarily always, appealing to the masses, because we have this desire for certainty. We have this desire for answers, living with the perennial questions. If you think of like the poet Rilke, this idea of living with the questions and living into the answers, what patience is required to maybe kick around a question for a decade.
Yeah, that's true. So perhaps there's even a problem that, let's say politics, if you get into kind of a lifelong career in politics, you kind of just jump into the game, and wisdom is something that requires a lifelong effort. And so you're not necessarily thinking about wisdom, but I think you're right. There are these examples of brilliant leaders who come along. Yeah, we might debate Abraham Lincoln. There seems to be something in their ability to, like, one thing my brother has instilled in me is a love of the great speeches of humanity and of history. Even great speeches of military generals, and how they speak to their soldiers in order to wake them up to the potential of the moment, wake them up to the potential that lies within them. And it seems like, when you hear a brilliant speech of the past, I'm not sure if there's going to be a question here, by the way, I'm feeling this question out. When you see these great speeches of the past, it's almost wisdom is almost something that you have to kind of feel in somebody. Like it's kind of like what did that American politician say about pornography? It was like, it's hard to define it, but when you see it, sort of thing. kind of the same with wisdom. You kind of have to feel it out, it's very hard to define, but you kind of know it when you see it. What do you think are some of the markers of somebody who who has wisdom. You've mentioned before we jumped on the show, you're very interested in humility. That might perhaps be part of it, but yeah, what do you think are some of the markers of true wisdom?
It's a good question. And I tend to think that it's a lot of different things in terms of paradox, whether it's even to go back to maybe Marcus Aurelius, for example. Wisdom to me may be something along the lines of a philosophy of life. We were talking about perspective, of maybe some examples being interconnectedness, or seeing impermanence, seeing with a beginner's mind. But then you also need some sort of principles or virtues that you're very clear about, that you follow. And then if you go a step further around practices, some things that bring these into place. So maybe an example that comes to mind for me is Abraham Lincoln. In his inaugural address, this famous line where he closes with of making a call to the better angels of our nature. Looking into that a bit, it's famous that he brought in these team of rivals, of these, people that are staunchly against him, and put them in place. And his initial draft, if you read it, of that inaugural address was very sharp, very direct. Didn't necessarily ring true to that we know of today, making this call to the better angels of our nature, this interconnectedness of trying to bring this divided group of people together. And it was one of his rivals, this person that is completely kind of against him, that wrote that line that he worked with to, basically go back and forth. So it's, individually, we're just kind of not enough, but collectively, back to maybe that passage of book 2 in Meditations, of these two hands working together, even this person that maybe Lincoln would describe as somebody that's ungrateful, somebody that's very difficult, but yet this person was someone that worked with him, two hands, the upper and lower teeth, to write this and obviously do many other things. But I wonder, how does that happen? There's a lot about virtues and principles, but I don't think that's the complete picture. Back to what we were kind of talking about in our previous conversation, it's, the how. It's something to do with maybe how you're seeing, are you seeing interconnectedness? Are you seeing kind of this impermanence, beginner's mind, and the list go on, that mostly poets, scientists, and, some philosophers and mystics kind of see in this way. And maybe not everybody, ever will, but how can you come to the realization that collectively, maybe like a mosaic or something, we can get a more complete picture if we realize, and have the wisdom, maybe like a Socrates or somebody, that, we don't quite have the complete picture, but collectively we could maybe put something together and get greater clarity.
Yeah, I'm really on board with that. And I wonder, could you expand a little bit on this little piece of historical information that you've given us, which I think is really important, that Abraham Lincoln actually put in place these people who were, kind of virulently against him. Was this, as far as was this a choice on his behalf, almost as a way to strengthen his own path, and to make sure that he was constantly having to be on his toes, and to actually, was it like a strategy of, let's put these people who are against me in these positions, and we'll let the ideas battle themselves out?
It was. And there's a great book that's, probably 10, 20 years old now, titled The Team of Rivals. I believe it won the Pulitzer. It's been a long time since I've got into it, but it was definitely, this strategic thing of doing that, and kind of the opposite of what most people do. When people are putting teams in place, it's probably stereotypically, a bunch of yes people, a bunch of like-minded people. It's very difficult. And back to maybe humility or wisdom or many terms. Maybe you could think of Jung in terms of the ego and all sorts of stuff of what would give somebody the wisdom, or what are the obstacles to working with these people and putting in place people that you're going to work with on a daily basis that have opposing views. It's kind of like if you take a big cosmic view from above, it makes complete sense to do that. But that's very difficult for us to do. Even if we sit, you and I, and do an exercise and take a view from above, our ego is still in there. Our desires are still in there. But Lincoln seems to be, I mean, you could look at maybe Mandela of another example of somebody coming out of prison after 27 years without this desire for revenge and things like that, kind of like forgiveness on the heart. There are some of these examples that are just wow, but I think examples of wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like the kind of inherent assumption, you might say, in making that choice is that it would be way better for me and for everybody if I had to fight for, my policies or my ideas to come out and fight. I mean, you kind of like, it's in that kind of rubbing up against, your opposition that you are strengthened, you're strengthened in the fire. And it seems like that's kind of, even though that is built into the American system with the kind of left-right party system, which I actually think is absolutely brilliant in so many ways. I wonder if we see enough of that today where leaders are actively seeking out to have conversations with people they very much disagree with, or to work closely with people who they very much disagree with. I'm sure that if we talked to a lot of the people in government, they would say that, yeah, we have very good relationships with people across the aisle. But I wonder if people are actively seeking that kind of pushing back against their ideas, or if they're just looking for, I don't know. What do you think? Have we lost a bit of that today? Or do you think that we're actually doing kind of well with that?
I think there's these human tendencies that we have. There's a human tendency to maybe hold on to certainty, maybe, oppose other groups, to get tribal. If you think of evolutionary psychology and stuff like that, which again, far from an expert in anything, but some of that does tell us that it's, from an evolutionary standpoint, we want to kind of fit in with tribes, and we see all sorts of that type of stuff in history. To bring up Jordan Peterson, obviously he talks quite a bit about our capacity for evil, and I think sometimes optimistically, I like how he talks about, man, the fact that we're not ripping each other apart. Wow, this is amazing. So
Yeah.
I do sometimes have an optimistic view. Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, which talks about the progress that has been made. I take that for what it is, and definitely believe the research behind that things are improving. But then the flip side, also, there's a lot of concern, some wise people that talk about the loneliness epidemic, and some of the things that maybe there's probably a lot of factors, but maybe social media and different things, and, anxiety and stress and well-being concerns. But I would say some of those things also have been universal and have probably existed since the start of time.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. We're certainly seeing the reemergence of these human tendencies, right? And you're right. We all have a lot to be very thankful for, and optimistic about. Even my brother yesterday, we were talking, and he kind of said, no matter really what happens to, either of us, he lives in America, I live over here in Australia, but he said, no matter what happens in the next few years, we can always be grateful that, pretty much whatever we have in our current societies, you probably have more than what a king had, a few hundred years ago. And, we are really living in one of the most fortunate times in history. I do believe that. I wonder if I could make a kind of left turn here, though it'll probably circle back into your career in the military. When did you jump into the military, and was it something that you found that you really wanted to do since a young child? Was this something that was very natural to you? And yeah, what was your path into the military?
That's a good question. I do think there is something that draws people to maybe the military or other similar type of professions, and I was one of those individuals that was kind of drawn to it, which is hard to explain. And then there are some people, friends of mine who would have never, that would be the last on a very long list of things that they would decide to do. But I believe I was 20 when I joined, and then did just over 20 years. So I was just over 40 or so when I retired a few years ago.
Mm.
But had a great time, and I think any connection to wisdom around some of that I think exists is something we've talked about around uncertainty. One of the things that you realize in the military is you kind of have to let go of some of these ideas of where you're going to live. You have to kind of work through like when you're going to move, maybe what you're going to do. You're part of this bigger system. And I do think that is a good exercise that many people just don't necessarily get an opportunity to be in, of something where you're literally not in control of some of these things that we often take for granted, like what you're going to do, where you're going to live, deployments, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There is so much uncertainty there. And I wonder, did you have a favorite superior in the military? Did you have a favorite leader within the military? Somebody who kind of nurtured you as a person? Was there anyone who sticks out to you?
I think sometimes when we're younger, we're maybe more open to recognize some of that, but definitely in one of my early assignments, I remember an individual that was just unbelievably joyful, like had an unwavering, we might call it attitude, or seemed happy. But as I think about it now, I mean, there was just something deeper than that. There was a bit of maybe peace um, going on. It's hard to describe, but yes, there was definitely this individual that um, wasn't necessarily, some sage or some, spectacular kind of like walk on water person. It was a very humble, happy to serve kind of individual that had an impact on not just myself, but many other young people, during that time.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And I've come across similar people in my life, based on your definition, these people who seem to just have a really, like you said, like a joyful disposition in life. And there's something really beautiful about that, these people who just are so encouraging and so loving and caring. And um, yeah, I wonder if that's something that you can choose. I wonder if it's something that you just kind of there's probably a bit of both, but some people are just like that, right? They just have that joyful disposition, and everywhere they go, they're kind of like a shining beacon of light that warms you, you might say.
To me, it connects with Nietzsche and this amor fati idea. Like if I think about this person, just a love of whatever comes, a love of not wanting things to be different. I'll give you an example since you bring it up. I don't know if I've ever shared this, but I'm a very young person, and this individual that I'm referring to was probably, late 30s or around 40, and basically told me to meet him at a certain place and time the next day. Um, he said, dress warm. I met him there and got in his vehicle, and we went and shoveled snow out of people's driveways of people that were deployed, and I remember very specifically this one this one driveway that I shoveled, which was like a foot of snow, and he is off, shoveling other driveways. And it was a spouse of a service member that was deployed overseas, that was there, that had a young child, literally probably would not have been able to shovel this driveway. And it's, how did he think? It makes sense in hindsight. Anybody would say like, oh yeah, that makes sense that was done. But how did he know that was, this act for the common good, to quote, Marcus Aurelius? It's interesting to even notice, because a lot of times we're just, we don't even see kind of these opportunities for acts for the common good. We don't necessarily think, hey, we should wake up at 6 a.m. and go shovel driveways because it's going to snow the night before, and there's people that may not be able to shovel their own driveway. So without, if you think back to that interconnectedness, he was connected. He was thinking about these other people, some of them that he didn't even know. Like he didn't know probably this person's spouse. And I remember kind of the next day, this spouse, made some sort of brownies or cookies or something like that. Just the deep appreciation that this, lady had for somebody thinking of her. Like to me, that's a special thing. And back to the how question, how do we notice? How do we see? How do we have the character to actually carry out these acts for the common good for, this Marcus Aurelius, what's good for the bees, good for the hive, or vice versa? We all know that intuitively, but it's very difficult to notice and to actually carry out.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And again, you're reminding me of this particular person when I grew up. His name was Brother Weepers. Very joyful person, very caring person, a real family man. But had that same ability to see opportunities for service and to get people involved. And this is also something that Sharon has spoken about recently. Just our need, especially in these kind of hyper-connected times when we can go, we can really just we can just get bogged down in our daily work or on social media, that sort of thing, that we don't notice the opportunities for the very simple daily acts of kindness that, if you really think about it, they deliver to us so much more than what they might even deliver to the other person. I mean, the joy that you get out of doing a very simple act of service. And do you think that perhaps, I think that's somewhat of a rare quality to find in people, that they will go out of their way to engage in these very simple, small acts of kindness that do the real big things for people. And I think that perhaps there might be an element of, we sometimes forget about those small actions because we're in search of something that would be bigger, more grandiose, something, a grand gesture or a grand adventure. I often find myself, moving away from these small, simple daily things that I could do because I'm so focused on the big end goal. How do you think we cultivate that what would you say, that desire maybe to engage in those very simple acts of service that, look, you're probably going to say, just go out and do it, which is a perfectly good answer. But I don't know, how do we cultivate that within ourselves? That ability to see those acts of service in the first place, even.
I think it's a wonderful question. I would love to ask Marcus Aurelius when he writes, meditate on the interconnectedness all throughout. Same thing in terms of Seneca. And as we said, many, many other people. But what does that mean? Like, how do you meditate on the interconnectedness? And he says often. Meditate often. Is that daily, hourly? What does that look like? It's just an often overlooked type of thing that I'm curious about. And then the same thing of those perspectives of just this impermanent thing of, I think sometimes we want to zoom out or think grandiose and big projects, where it's like, if we look to Seneca, the whole future lies in uncertainty. Live right now. All we have is right now. Sometimes it reminds me of this on the shortness of life of we're making plans of what's in fortune's hand, and some of that. But I think we can cultivate it. I think these reminders of getting into, ancient lessons for modern life, or good, even, modern books that are coming out. If we get into these things often and have some sort of philosophy of life that we want to follow, I do think we can cultivate these things almost more easily than we realize. Are we going to become, sages, or maybe even, close to that? Now, maybe some of that is much more difficult, but I do think we can gain a lot of ground just by, maybe sitting down and developing your own kind of philosophy of life, coming up with some maxims that you think about. I think they can get in our bones and really influence us. These reminders, because we easily forget. I think of that example of the shoveling the driveway. Maybe this person was like, well, you could leave life right now. Maybe he was a Marcus Aurelius fan, and reminding himself that tomorrow is not promised, so I better wake up and do this. And maybe that has to do with cultivating a good character. But I think it's all these things are complex, difficult, but maybe they're simple in a way. Simple, not easy type of deal is one of those common sayings.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think in general, like when I've observed the kind of people because I have observed a lot of people who would engage in service projects for others in communities, but you can see that some people, it's very natural in terms of, they understand that the reward is inherent in the service, right? You're going to get something out of it, and they're very happy to help out. And other people, including myself at times, it was kind of, it was an act of service. I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to go, do this thing. I really like what you say about the interconnectedness of everything, because if you really understand that idea, what you should see, and I think this is something that Sharon would say as well, is that there's no such thing as a small act of service. And so even my question, how do we cultivate this desire to do the small acts of service? That's the wrong question, because there is no such thing as small when it comes to service. It leaves ripple effects throughout everything. And in the same way that, I think in Germany, they have this saying, it's like, if everybody cleans up the front of their home, then you have a clean city. If everybody would engage in seemingly small acts of service, once every so often, I mean, imagine the good that could come about from that. But we have to first believe that there would be infinite possibilities for good out of a seemingly finite act of service. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I would love to add that sometimes that small act of service is simply listening to a podcast, picking up a book. If you take seriously some of the wise quotes from the past of everybody kind of wanting to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves, was Tolstoy. And there's a million other people that have said kind of that same thing. We have a tendency to want to look external for some sort of act for the common good, to change something, but really that small little ripple might just be starting a journaling practice or picking up a book or any number of things that might cultivate a good character. There's always that tendency. I mean, if we think of acts for the common good, maybe someone providing wrong directions, incorrect medical advice, to that person, they are absolutely feeling that they're out there saving the world, performing these acts for the common good. Well, not exactly. That's why it's like it starts with us. I think Mother Teresa said something around, like throwing a stone, creating some sort of ripple. She talked about, feeding one person. I think it's both, like cultivating a good character, act for the common good. That paradox of that and being, the most important word in there is how I'm kind of thinking about it these days.
Yeah,
How
I
about you?
like that example of feeding this one person, because what the Stoics would say as well is all you can do is feed this one person, and then perhaps you do it again, but you're still just feeding one person at a time. That's what you're doing. And you're right, so many brilliant ripple effects can come from that. You mentioned at the very start of the interview your fascination with some of the early Christian mystics. Now, this is something that I'm looking to dive into, because I feel like these are exactly the people I need to be reading at the moment, studying divinity. But that's the direction I'm going. I'm not necessarily as much interested in the academic theologians as I am in the mystics, because I feel like the mystics, their job is to have the experience, of oneness, of wholeness, of salvation, whatever they call it, and then to deliver that experience to the people and say, this is how it feels. And I'm much more interested in that. So who are some of your favorite of the perhaps the church fathers or the Christian mystics, and what is it that you take away from their writings?
I would say I'm mostly influenced by some modern writers that write about mystics, like a Richard Rohr or Thomas Merton, who is passed, or Thomas Keating. But if you look at Saint Francis, Saint Ignatius, some of these individuals, their ideas of humility sound pretty extreme. Um, it's this paradox of being small, but also at the same time as being big. This idea of a spiritual path. I heard something when I was in an interview with Carl McColman, who wrote the book Eternal Heart. I can't remember who he quoted, but he said if the spiritual path goes anywhere, it's a quarter of an inch long. This idea of, it's right here. There's no reason to go anywhere. And I think that connects with philosophical wisdom, as well. Just this idea of not necessarily adding, but taking away. And there's a tendency for us to we want to add, we want to do more. But sometimes it's the opposite. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's a
No, it
bit of a
does.
ramble.
Well, I just love this idea that the spiritual path, if it goes anywhere, it's a half an inch long. That's beautiful. It really makes me think of something that Heraclitus said. He said, men dig tons of earth to find an ounce of gold. and to the person who perhaps doesn't have the mystic kind of mind to see in that, they'll think, what's he talking about there? But there's this idea. What I take away from that is he's kind of saying, out here, you spend your entire life digging, you find an answer, God, yes, this is it. But the spiritual path, or the path of wisdom, is like, it's something that you dig within, but you find tons of gold in there. I wrote this poem recently called Gold Digging, and it was about just that. It's about, you can search for wisdom, which is the greatest treasure you could possibly find. And you come across sometimes and you think, man, this is so much more valuable. When you really get a taste for what wisdom might be, you realize that it is so much more valuable than anything you could spend your entire life working to gain, right? And we have access to that. And there's almost I'm starting to really find a lot of value in the kind of theological language that can help us to think about wisdom, such as revelation. There's a revelatory aspect to wisdom where it's something that kind of just descends upon you. There's this little idea or this thought that pops into your mind, and you think, where the hell did that even come from? But it's here. My job is to grab that and to say, let's inspect this. What might it do for me? What might it do for others? Sometimes it seems to me it even comes in just a little bit of inspiration about the direction you might be going in your life, right? Or an idea that you think, man, that is something that if I could achieve that, how much good could come about from that? How do you experience, do you have a meditation practice? Do you have any routines that enable you to find space for receiving deeper wisdom for your life?
I do. I tend to think kind of in broad terms of maybe like a stillness practice. But I have bounced around quite a bit. But I tend to think of it, broadly speaking, of making time for stillness, for sitting quietly alone, like to quote Pascal, I believe, how it's just this difficult thing and sometimes whether it's a formal meditation or if somebody just sets out on I'm going to sit still for 10 minutes. It's a difficult thing. There are always kind of this resistance or this pull or these obstacles. But I like the idea of centering prayer as well, which is very similar to traditional, many different, obviously, meditation practices, but very similar, and have read a bit about kind of the roots of some of these Christian meditation practices that are very similar. I had an author on who wrote a book, Centering Prayer, Brian Russell, which is a really good one and kind of practical, that goes through the steps of how one would do that. But I think sometimes just the word meditation or even thinking about what you're going to be doing can be a bit of an obstacle or a bit of I guess I want to say distraction or confusion. Maybe a starting point is just finding time for stillness, finding time to sit and do nothing, if you will.
Yeah.
And obviously beyond that, there's many things that you can do, but I think about like the entry point, even though there's a lot of people that practice meditation, it's still probably only maybe 1 out of 100. How can that number grow?
Yeah. Well, I like
Yeah.
what you're doing in terms of saying there might be some obstacles that get in your way, even in the way that you think about meditation. So perhaps a better word to use would just be stillness, wherever, find a practice that allows that. That might be prayer, that might be meditation, that might be going into nature and sitting down amongst the trees, and just finding time to just pause amidst the kind of hectic life that we often live. And I think that's probably a good place to finish up here, Joshua, this has been such a beautiful conversation. And as we were saying before we started, I mean, we're going to continue to build this relationship. Birds of the feather flock together, and I feel very akin to you in terms of your own path. And I want to thank you for what you're doing. Do you want to just let everybody know where they can find you and perhaps how they can get involved in what you're doing?
Yes. And I have to say, likewise, absolutely love connecting with you. And I'm truly grateful for your time. And I appreciate you having me on. For anybody interested in learning more, they could go to perennialleader.com. There's some articles on things that I'm curious about. There's a couple podcasts, In Search of Wisdom, which is an interview-based authors like yourself and many others that are about 50 episodes in. And then there's another podcast, which is the Perennial podcast, which is only about 20 or so episodes in, which is kind of these short reflections that are maybe hopefully reminders for people. Most episodes are 3 to 4 minutes with occasional kind of just casual conversations with, some curious minds and fellow wisdom seekers that I have on.
Yeah.
But thanks so much.
No, thank you. I'm going to have you on again. And it looks like the light is shining in now. This is the time of morning when I start to look like an angel descending from heaven. So a good time to jump off. But thank you so much, Joshua. This has been beautiful. And we'll talk again soon.
All right. My pleasure. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden Podcast. If you'd like to attend any of our free meetups and events, or if you'd like to get one-on-one mentoring with either Sharon Lebell, Kai Whiting, or myself, just go to thewalledgarden.com. But for now, don't forget to nourish those gardens in your mind.